have a brilliant guest, the founder of Strong Path CIC, championing neurodivergent individuals to live with confidence and dignity in the world, which often overlooks their needs. Someone I've known for about best part of a week, actually, and we got on, I think, really well on our conversation. It was a bit of a eye opener for me. I think we've got a lot of similar experiences, so I thought we'd just do more of a freestyle ep today and really talk a little bit about what you do, your background, and see where that takes us.
No, that's cool. So I started coaching about 12 years ago, coming off the back of a big breakup. And I was at a place in my life where I kind of knew I didn't want to do what I was doing, but I kind of didn't really know where I wanted to go with it. I kind of remember taking, this was at my 30 actually, it was when I was 30, and I remember taking some like time to kind of read some self-help books
Mm,
and look at where I was, how did I get here, and ultimately I think that I really kind of looked at when was I happy at work, because
yeah,
ultimately I haven't been happy at work for a really long time. So what did that look like, and can I try and replicate that again moving forward? I ended up working at a big commercial gym for a few years, and there I piloted a scheme with the RNIB, working with visually impaired people.
yeah,
And then later on, in my first kind of unit, I suppose I was actually subletting. I ended up running a study for the social services and the NHS. So both those things were really cool. Kind of really enjoyed it, but wanted to do something a bit more social, but I didn't really know how to go about it. And then kind of fast forward, to May last year, I started working with a wonderful human being called Abby, and Abby just kind of highlighted to me kind of the horror stories that she told me that she'd been through in terms of with
right,
fitness. Good coaches coach because they want to help people. Yeah, we want to
yeah.
see them get from one place to another, whatever that is. And coaching doesn't need to be sport, can be whatever. But one of the things that kind of really struck me was actually like what happened with Abby was way beyond. I sat there and I went, wow, like this is really cool. Can we like maybe focus on this a little bit more? Um, and initially, I started the CIC to just try and get some grants so that people that can't afford my services, that we can actually get them in and can work with them as
Yeah.
well. And then the whole thing snowballed and turned into, I like to call it a monster at the moment because it is a bit of a monster. But interestingly, we're talking about ADHD. I only got
Mm,
formally diagnosed a year ago, and subsequently, I've only been on medication for that year. And ironically, my life has turned around like beyond belief. My
yeah.
ability to work, everything is more than 1,000% better. Like it's crazy. So I think that's probably got a big part to play in how I've ended up kind of here and where I am.
I think just in that amazing description of your work and a little bit about yourself that we can dive into. There's so many points to pull from it, and with ADHD, I have a tendency to want to then explore really, go off on tangents. So I think it would be good to just start from the beginning, really. And so you got diagnosed, you said about a year ago.
Yeah, so I got diagnosed. I think it's pretty much almost like a year to the day at this point. I think it was January, February time last year, and that came about
Okay.
from working with a therapist for 3 years and just deciding that that's where we needed to go with it.
And so that's very similar to myself. I think my diagnosis was about 2.5 years ago. But so before that diagnosis, did you, obviously in childhood, feel different, or was there a feeling that you might have had ADHD? Did you even have awareness of what that was at the
Yeah,
time?
so I mean, I was actually kind of soft diagnosed with ADHD as a child. So
Right.
I went to a childhood psychologist first off when I think I was about 5 or 6 because of dyslexia. And actually, they couldn't diagnose me at that point because they said that I was too young. And
Right.
then when I was 8, I went and got diagnosed for my dyslexia. The psychologist turned around and said to my parents, have you considered the ADHD diagnosis as well? Because he presents very strongly for that as well. And the problem is, my parents then kind of didn't. So I then consequently went
Mm,
through life. I mean, feeling abnormal, absolutely. Yeah, I think that one of the problems is that even if you're neurodivergent, right, and you have the
Yeah.
best childhood ever and you're not diagnosed, I'm still guessing that that's quite a traumatic thing anyway, because
Yeah.
ultimately, not feeling like you fit in, not understanding those things as a child, that's quite a heavy thing for anyone to just with that alone. That is a big thing.
I think although I was diagnosed 2.5 years ago, I'm probably about the same level of kind of unmasking, if you will, for want of a
Yeah,
better term. I'm still learning all these traits of like, this is wrong behavior, this is, all that conditioning that you tell yourself. It's interesting because I agree. I think if you're a kid, especially, kind of teenage years, largely defining your identity based on how you fit into different social groups. And it can be quite conformist at the best of times at that age. There's a lot of peer pressure, there's a lot of wanting to fit in. And if you don't have that frame of reference, it's almost like a minority of one. It's a very unique identity. It's not like necessarily
it's
race or
lonely.
sexuality.
It's
Right,
lonely.
it's isolating because it's not because you don't even technically know that that is what
No,
it is. So you haven't been able to go, oh, don't, I'm embracing this. This is a strength. This is maybe a challenge, but you can't normalize something until you even know what aspect of your thinking is largely explained by that diagnosis, right?
so
So
I
that
remember going to
happens.
I remember going to a therapist when it was a school therapist, so I must have been about 14 or
Mm,
15 at this time. I at which point given up on school, if I'm completely honest. But this therapist, we were talking one day, and she was really cool. Actually, she would actually take me out of school sometimes. She was like, "Look, let's just get out of here because you look like you're about to explode." I wasn't, at least not physically. Inside, I might have been
mm,
imploding, but not necessarily externally. But she said to me like, "What's going on for you?" And I was just like, "I'm looking for something." And I
yeah,
genuinely like that is the feeling like I don't belong here. I'm looking for something. I couldn't tell you for anything what that thing I'm looking for is, but I just feel like there is something I'm incomplete in some way. And as a 14-year-old, I didn't understand that really. But I think that now, kind of looking back on it, for me, the dyslexia was hard because the
yeah.
dyslexia actually made me go down a year in school. And being kind of small and sickly as I was, then kind of being put down a year, like that really messed me up a little bit because I don't know, I felt like everyone was looking at me as if I was stupid. And then to top that off, that actually I couldn't concentrate anyway. So, you could put me on whatever year, it probably wouldn't have made much of a difference. I actually ended up going to a school for a term and they put me down another year. So at one point I was 2 years behind at school. And, I mean, in terms of your own kind of personal ego, that's not good for someone's ego. Like if
No.
already you feel isolated and alone, then to then kind of make your peers have something else that is even more obvious that you're not like them. The real sad thing is that I think I said to you this in a chat. I remember like after diagnosis, I was looking at something, and I think it was about medication because I was a bit unsure. And I went on Reddit just to see like kind of if there's anything on there.
Mm,
And I came across this really cool group on Reddit, but one of the real things that struck me was just the amount of people that were in their 30s and 40s, just only getting diagnosed now, and just this grief and pain and like, yeah, it's amazing that it happened and we got diagnosed, happy days, but there is so much pain that is
100%. I'm still going for it.
yeah, well, I don't
I
think you
think
ever
we're
get through it.
probably living embodiments of it, aren't we, really? It's
Yeah,
interesting, James, because a couple of things that you said. So, I mean, you're very clearly you're very clearly good with articulating yourself. It just goes to show what dyslexia really doesn't have any bearing on what you have to say. Just to me, so many things that you say really mirror my experience. But what I've seen, obviously, I'm just using the frame of reference of newbie, really. So just to give everyone a snapshot as well. Really, I'll be completely honest. Very typical of me. It started as a bit of a whim, probably an impulse, really, where it's almost like a napkin paper thing of setting the world to rights. How are we going to? Because I saw the stats on autistic employment and then neurodivergent, and I just knew that didn't it didn't compare with the experience that I had with that community and understanding the strengths that I could see and they couldn't. And it evolved into me using recruitment as a kind of a vessel to really start to tackle some of that neuro-inclusion and get more people in the workplace. And one thing that was very clear, well, whilst there's a lot of grey area in neurodivergence, the clear line I could see is that late diagnosed individuals compared to people that were diagnosed really early, the level of trauma and some of that baggage and that psychological damage that's done was so stark. A lot of things like addiction, for instance, and
Oh well, I mean,
suicidal ideation. And yeah, I'm the same. I had,
yeah,
you
I'm
know,
quite happy to talk about mine as well because I don't. That's one thing I've found actually of late is that I used to be really ashamed of
mm,
my kind of, especially my like late teens and
mm,
kind of my 20s were riddled with problems. Drugs, loads of alcohol, loads of sex. And like I kind of spoke to you about was, ended up really with me getting in trouble with the police. And yeah,
yeah,
but I think that, I think that the real sad thing is that I think that we're one of many like that go through these sorts of things. I would
yes,
love to have a look at the prison system and see like, how many people in there. I mean, this is the thing, right? And we were watching, Rachel and I, my wife, were watching something last night, and we were talking about this. I won't go into the topic because the topic is quite dark, but it's that sense of, when you get someone at the point where you've arrested them and you're charging them for something, okay? Well, all eyes on them. You are a horrific human being, and one thing I will stipulate before I say what I'm about to say is that we all have a choice, okay?
yes, exactly.
And we are all
They have autonomy over the
accountable.
decisions, but
Yeah,
there's still an
absolutely.
explanation for you.
Yeah,
There are still
yeah, yeah.
things that factor into that we can't just decouple from the situation
No.
and turn it into. Because when you do that, you don't solve the problem. It's like people talk about. I was having an argument with someone who was talking about people that steal, shoplifters. They don't look at the socioeconomics and they don't look at the choices. To say someone makes bad choices, some people's choices are you know go to prison or but be able to eat that day,
Yeah,
or you see
absolutely.
what I
No, no,
mean.
absolutely. No, absolutely.
So it's that kind of thing, isn't it? You have to really see what's underpinning it. But
Yeah, no,
it's
absolutely.
interesting that you spoke um, about the school system and how it fails people, and a lot of those people might end up in prison. Weirdly, I was watching, I don't know if you remember a show. It was where they take kids to a prison because they're bad kids that may end up in adult prison,
Yeah, I've seen. I know
and they
exactly
and
what
they
you're
try and
on now. Yeah, yeah,
well, they took these British kids right to the American one, and it's just this like horrific place, and they're shouting about the darkest of the darkest
yeah,
subjects, and they were looking at these kids, and realistically, what it came down to, one of them was couldn't sit still in a classroom. And instead of that being seen as, all behavior is language, right? Instead of that's being seen as, well, that person, that's a survival mechanism. It's not what you say about that. It says more about yourself, right? We project a meaning and we'll say, well,
yeah,
that's defiance or that's anger, but we wouldn't say that if a house was burning down and I'm screaming, you wouldn't say, "Oh, Jack, just calm down." But that is literally how it
yeah,
feels to that
dude.
individual.
Yeah,
And so that really that person needed therapy
yeah.
and needed support, and they are using this kind of compliance discipline paradigm, if you
You
will,
think about it. You
because
think
it
about that.
works for everyone, but it doesn't work for everyone.
But
Even then, people that are not neurodivergent.
you look at that for whatever that child is. Okay, they're children, and I think this is the other thing is everyone sits there and goes, "Oh, this person, he's 14 years old, and he did this thing, and oh, let's try him as an adult." And you're like, no, that's a child. Like, no matter what
Exactly.
that person's done, that's still a child. We have to have distinguished, like, I mean,
Yeah,
let's face
and it's
it,
still
right?
a collective failing. We all play a part in
Yeah,
shaping society. I'm someone that sees. I don't see that. Obviously, people have varying levels of familiarity with me, and you're in a circle. You kind of, you have a different relationship with. But by large, I don't see this distinction. You have to, in order for society to improve, you have to actively seek means to support people. And so, at that age, when you can go into destructive behaviors that ultimately lead in disaster, why are we not seeing that person and their potential
it's
and finding ways in which,
so. I
you
think
know?
that I think that and actually, do you know what? Let's big up your business for a little bit because I think that this is an easy one to kind of do. When we look at it, right? I've got a meeting on Friday morning with my MP, Caroline Noakes. All right,
Oh
and
yeah,
So it was off the back of, did you see that whole thing about them trying to reduce assessments for ADHD and autism in the UK?
Yes. Yeah.
So I think it's ADHD UK put out, it was really cool actually. They put out this thing where you just had to click it, you put your postcode in, it found your MP, and you put your email in, they bang an email across for you.
Yeah.
I was like, oh, awesome! Like, kind of, you know, I went private for my assessment because I couldn't wait 7 years. Anyway, consequently, you know, she emailed me back and she said, look, you know, I mean, it was probably a copy and paste, but you know, fair play to her. Someone had to write that email at some point, and you know, it answered it, so I can't really complain about that. And I ended up responding to her, and I can't remember exactly what I said, but I turned around and said, look, I said, why don't you just look at this from an economic point of view? I said, because, you know, like I said to you earlier, my year in terms of my ability to perform at work has ridiculously been good, okay? And that is by no short, you know, by nothing else, right? That is because I've been diagnosed and I'm given the medication I need to function. I said, now you're talking about, you know, dropping these down to, you know, the bare minimum when they're not even there yet. You sit there and you think, well, that's going to have an impact on the economy. And the problem is that the people in power at the moment seem too stupid for some, or, you know, they can't see that actually you're missing something here, you know, like, let's take Abby. Abby came to the gym. Abby's got autism and ADHD, okay, and some other stuff, but that's the important bit in this conversation. Abby came to the gym, she got supported and, you know, found a place that accepted her and got fitter and stronger, and consequently she now works for the ambulance service, okay? So Abby's not only contributing to society through taxes, all right, but actually she's using the doctors less because, you know what, her anxiety might not be so bad, her depression might not be so bad, you know, she's getting fitness, she's getting all the rest of it. And the truth of it is that by looking at people, neurodivergent people, and all people that may have disabilities or things that kind of stop them from being able to kind of fully integrate into society in the way that society wants them, by sitting there and going, oh, look, they're a pain, and let's just push those over there, all right, it's so short-sighted, because actually, if you sit there and go, oh no, what can we do to make that person feel a bit better? What can we do to encourage them? What can we do to remove the barriers for them? Well, suddenly you've got a workforce, okay, and you've got people in there. You've got reduction on NHS kind of services. It's a win-win. And the thing is that as well that really frustrates me about this is I have been in and out of doctor surgeries my whole life, but
hundreds of times.
Yeah, I've been on
thousands.
every single antidepressant I've been on. All right,
same,
and some other things, you know.
A lot of things. Yeah, I mean, maybe 50. That's how crazy it is.
Yeah.
Just because. And how long does it take to do that assessment?
And this is the point, though, isn't it? So, how many times are you backwards and forwards for a GP? How much is that GP having? What is the cost of that? You know, financially. What is the cost in that? In the sense that GP can't see the other person that actually really needs their help, and all the rest of it. When it took one assessment, consequently, I do have to talk to my psychiatrist. All right, so that is. But nowhere near as much as the other stuff I was doing. No. And at the same time, I'm putting money back into the system because I'm actively like doing better in terms of work. So why just look at why? Let's stop this old way of looking at things. Let's sit there and say, all right, what can we do? What can we do to help? You know, I think that there'd be such a huge positive thing that if someone in power in the political system said, do you know what, let's approach this in a different way. We're not getting anywhere with the approach now because they're not. All right, why don't we look at actually doing what they need, and let's see what that looks like at the end of it, because at the moment it's not working.
There's so many threads to pick up on that. Firstly, you know, how I approach newbie is that whilst we are focusing on this community because I guess their needs are a little bit more distinct and pronounced, the approach benefits everyone. And so we look at it as realistically everyone's masking to a degree.
Yeah,
of course. And we try to see it as like, well, what's the upshot from this? So personalizing so that everybody can get the best out of their performance, right? And I think that's kind of the approach that seems to work for us. But when you look at those statistics, and I try not to attribute to malice what can be explained by incompetence, right? But it's actually across mental health too. So sick days and
Yeah,
retention are all
yeah.
impacted because we don't fundamentally grapple with mental health and well-being. But then it becomes, a question of even just those accommodations themselves. This is where the difficulty is. People don't realize the number of barriers that it takes for people to actually even get to the point of applying for a job. So if you've had, you may have had terrible experiences in education, you may have turned down 3 or 4 opportunities, the job spec might not be accessible, then you see in the company that there's no one like you, or they're not giving you that feeling that it's a place that's conducive to bringing the best out of you. But we frame it as as long as we make it a meritocracy, but in order to broaden that so that more people apply, there's a lot more that you need to do in terms of awareness, and that's kind of something that we're focusing on. But I mean, just to bring it back into the question of just the NHS and that approach, I've had experiences where I'm probably using parts of the NHS that are not designed for what my needs were. So you speak to people that go into A&E just so and then they get emergency care, and then because they cannot, that assessment they can't do, they get medication that's short term, it has side effects, and then obviously you're coming off of those, and it's like you get thrown through the system. When people don't realize the ADHD assessment is 36 questions, it's 1, maybe 2 other follow-ups with a psychiatrist, right? And yes, there is then support that you may need afterwards. When people talk about atypical or not normal, normal has changed.
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah, yeah.
that's
Absolutely.
not that's not even a concrete framework in which to say you can't attribute that to what the value is or how objectively true that is. So what's normal now will change, and what
I hope it does
I
as well. I
yeah,
hope
well,
it
it,
does
it
keep
needs
changing, if I'm
to,
honest.
and the difficulty of it is we've got this kind of red herring of objectivity and measurement, right? And so we say, okay, this is the approach. We've got these. We can capture whether it's an assessment, these traits that we want to see, but we don't realize how much of those processes are subjective, right? So you see like these conventional wisdoms that are on LinkedIn about the best way to do outreach, for example. In reality, that is packaged to be scalable, that advice. So you can commodify it. So you can say, go in my funnel. I'm going to give you a template for how to speak to people. But most people realize that it's much more complex than that. It's
I
relationships in
think,
business are built fluidly, right? And it's the same with in terms of how you get from A to B in a company. You need different types of thinking. It
I think
doesn't
that,
fit this rigidity.
I think that that's the thing. I think that if we go back to the tests, I went to a really cool Seeds talk with Rachel Mosley, Dr. Rachel Mosley,
Okay.
and she's awesome anyway. So she is an autistic academic who specialises in qualitative research
Okay.
within the autism, space. And what was keeping this particular one was about people assigned female at birth. All right,
Hmm.
and what was really interesting was they were talking about the fact that first off, up until the 90s, you couldn't get diagnosed if you were a woman or gender female at birth, right? You couldn't. But the other thing is, if you didn't go in and answer, let's say, 10 questions, if you couldn't answer absolutely every 10 perfectly, oh, you're not autistic. Yeah, which is
So
just
if you're 90%, it's like none of that matters.
no, no.
It's
And the
yeah.
thing is that it still doesn't look perfect now because
No.
one of the biggest things that we see, especially with assigned gender at birth female, is that autism in that part of the community, it's really hard to tell. Like
There's a lot of
and they
masking, isn't there?
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And what people don't seem to realize is that masking ends up being more than masking. It's not more masking, but you get so good at it that actually you could try and not do it, and you would probably instinctively still do it because that
Yeah.
thing kept you safe for however long. All right, your body and your
And
brain, they're not.
you've done that. You've conditioned yourself at
Yeah,
very
absolutely.
impressionable ages where your brain's developing. It's
Yeah.
not as simple as just a habit. It's a real deep learned behavior.
Yeah, absolutely. So even when you're in the assessment process, you still might mask. Even though you don't want to, you might do it because ultimately that's what you've had to do to that point. So, people getting that diagnosis. I got a lovely lady at work, all right, but she said to me the other day, she likes to kind of throw a caveat. She likes to kind of call my bluff on stuff sometimes. And we were talking about this subject about people not getting assessed. And she went, well, maybe we don't need as many assessments, blah, blah, blah. And I was almost like triggered, I kind of had that, oh, don't you dare. I'm gonna
Don't
and
upend my worldview overnight.
oh no, don't, because I went on a rant, and I do. I go on rants all the time with everything that I kind of believe strongly about, which it probably isn't good because I'm not inviting conversation at that point.
Yeah.
But at this point, I don't care because I've read more than you do. I've done. I'm going to try and like kind of show you the reality of what you've just said. And I ended up saying to that person, and that ultimately I agree. Like, not everyone does need a diagnosis, all right.
Mhm.
And if you've got through your life and you're happy and successful and everything's going all right, and you don't want a diagnosis, happy days. But we're not really talking about you as a person. The person what we're talking about is the person that actually
The
is having
person that obviously needs
difficulty,
to. Yeah.
and the person that is having anxiety and depression, and
Yep.
And I said, me knowing my community, it's been huge for me. I for once don't feel alone. Like, I didn't feel alone because my wife's amazing anyway. But like, mate, I felt really, really, really alone for a really, really long time.
I would say
And
mine is even like, sorry to interrupt. I'm
no,
just
go for it,
like,
dude.
so mine is so profound. I wouldn't even, the words don't come to mind. The best way I can say it is I have conversations with now more neurodivergent people than not. And everything that you think about neurodivergence changes, but at the same time yourself. So, for instance, you have a call with 7 of us, right? And two have got ADHD, very impulsive, someone with dyslexia. What's the common misconception is that that's going to be chaotic and just a nightmare. Basically, it's like a Royal Rumble. It's not, because I think there's a much deeper kind of understanding of what that isolation is and that need to be validated is. And like everything, you regulate around each. It's like co-regulation. When you have a conversation with someone, it's not tennis, is it? You don't go, you speak, I speak, you speak. It's still very innately human, and so it's the first conversations where somebody has realized that I have different preferences than what would be typical, and so naturally they arrive at that conversation asking me things that would help set the tone and make me feel comfortable. And then my ADHD traits have significantly reduced, and whilst I'll still go off on tangents, I'm still a bit impulsive, I'll talk a lot, the emotional resonance of that hasn't been as nearly as negative. Whereas for 10, 15, 20, however many years, every meeting I've been in, I've been self-critical, and it's not that the onus is on the other person to necessarily be psychic, but it's just a natural thing that and you're talking about the idea that some people mask so much they might not even be able to separate that from who they are. Well, the more I've spoken to autistic folk and folk with ADHD, OCD, I've realized how much what I actually want is very similar to what a lot of neurodivergent folk want. I like more explicit language. I find that, I was saying this to someone recently. I've said no maybe 10,000 times, when if I'd have felt comfortable, that could have been 10,000 yeses to opportunities, to experiences. And a lot of that is just because I can't control how I'm going to feel in that environment. And it didn't feel in any way like anybody was, giving me that space to state basically what my needs were. I just said no. And that's a neurotypical kind of conditioning. And so
I
it's
think
it's overnight.
I think that's the thing, though, isn't it? That, I mean, what you're talking about for me is barriers. you know,
Yes.
and you know, and now barriers can work both ways, can't they?
Hmm.
We always think of barriers as I'm putting this barrier down, but actually that might be I'm actually lifting that barrier up, and I'm allowing that person in because I
Mm.
feel safe enough to be able to do that. I think you know, especially in my work, I had a really cool thing this week actually. I coached a guy last week who is autistic and has cerebral palsy, and awesome guy, right? You know, really awesome guy. Again, it makes me quite sad because I don't think that he's had the most easy of times in
No.
life. And you know that I've spoken to the fact that we're piloting a scheme out in Hampshire at the moment to try or we're about to pilot a scheme in Hampshire to
Yes.
try and work with some partner gyms and stuff. I sent him a text because I'm just a little bit too far away from him, in all honesty. And I sent him a text and said, "Oh, hey, look, what if you want to? There would probably be a space on the pilot for you, and I know that there's a gym potentially a lot closer." He turned around and went, "Yeah, but will you be coaching it?" And I was like,
Yeah.
"No," because the energy that it took for him to come to my gym was insane. I know it would have been an insane amount of energy. You know, he would have been really nervous. He'd have been fearful. There would have been,
Mm.
you know, I think he said so he's good friends with one of my other clients, and I think he said to him like, oh, is he going to be okay with disabilities and stuff? And I'm sitting there going, man, that shouldn't be a question you should have to ask anyone whether or not they're okay with that, or whether or not they don't want to try and facilitate anyone in any way they can.
Yeah,
But I
exactly.
think that you know, because that took such a big thing for him, now the thought of doing that again is like, and not to know that someone like me guaranteed me was there, he's not so sure. But that's the community, isn't it? And I think that's that's the other hard thing is that, no, I don't know about you, but kind of at the moment in terms of our business,
Mm.
or yeah, no, our business CIC, um, you want to do everything and you want to do it all for free, right?
Yeah.
You do because you want to make a change. I mean, I've given away to more than the neurodivergent. I've done neurotypical and all the rest of it. You know.
That's what happened with recruitment. You know, first year of business, and there was just opportunities where I wanted to facilitate a better culture basically for a few neurodivergent folk, and the only way I could do that was for free, so I just did it. But it shouldn't be expected.
Right.
That's a mantle that unfortunately isn't taken up by corporates really, and I find that quite frustrating because they seem to get involved with these issues once once the value is easier to extract and a lot of the work is done. I've noticed this with the community. The same people that are unemployed and have been by and large marginalized by the entire industry, when I've supported them and kind of giving them a bit of a shout out and championing, you get everybody seeing their value as if it's changed, as if overnight they've become a very good developer and a very good UX and you're like, no, it's just that I spotted it before it was even worth anything for me. It wasn't transactional. I simply
Yeah,
think that it's unacceptable to not see that there are hundreds of different ways that we arrive at a similar outcome.
I think that's the thing, and I think that one of the things I do hope is that I know for a fact. So look what we're doing. We're doing something where ultimately we're gonna put people from our community into gym spaces in dead spots. Okay, and dead spots are times in the day where other people don't want to be there. All right, so maybe it's in the middle of the day, maybe it's a little slightly later in the evening, wherever it is. We're looking at dead spots. So ultimately, we're going to make that gym more money because we're going to put people in there where they can't put people in there. Does that make sense? Like it doesn't
Yeah,
work. Now,
absolutely.
some people might say, well, is that not kind of, you know, making it like you're not prioritizing the neurodivergent people? Is the honest answer is we can't afford to take those prime times out of those spaces. The cost
No.
is just would be astronomical, like as in beyond astronomical, because we wouldn't have such a reduced amount of people within there anyway.
Yeah.
But I tell you what, someone will, you know, that people will be happy about it when it gets done, and oh, isn't this great? A little bit like what you just said, and the thing is that I kind of hope no one gets it at the moment because that means that the ones of us that are doing it can do it properly
And keep going.
and set a standard that, and you know, ultimately our standard's going to be higher than anyone that if we're prepared to put in that work and drive it and make sure our community's right, looked after from the way that we feel they should be, because ultimately we're part of that community. then I think we'll do a damn sight better job than anyone that isn't part of our community that's just trying to, completely economically benefit from it. So I hope that, I think the thing is,
I'm hopeful, because I think if you give people value and consistently, and you really acknowledge them, that is actually, ironically, I think you've actually got a better ecosystem for
yeah,
business.
no,
It's
no,
just that you're
absolutely.
not arriving, we're both not going into it with that intent. So whilst, there are companies that try to exploit a lot of the community, I don't see them as having long-term success, because a lot of the
No.
conversations I'm having, people are seeing some of the whitewashing, kind of DEI washing and all that kind of stuff that's happening.
I think that, like, from what you said, you've got stakeholder, you've got people guiding that process, and that's
Mm.
really important. We have it at work. We have to have it. Like, it's the most important thing. You're talking to people. You're building something from a stakeholder point of view. So what that
Hmm.
means is that you're getting people's voices within the community you work in, directing your work. All right. One of the things that we're looking at, because we're running a study with the University of Bath, and one of
Okay.
the biggest things when you come to looking at the science of it all is that, okay, how much of the science has been done by neurotypical people putting their expectations on, what they think people are going to want, rather than actually asking them asking an autistic person, what do you want? If you look at science, up until, like, not very long ago, it was all white men that got did studies anyway. That nothing was studied on anyone other than that.
ADHD is a prime example. So is autism. There's
Yeah,
practically no female
right.
informed diagnostics, and so there's a gender gap. And when we see
So
this kind of 4-to-1, 5-to-1 ratio of diagnosis, I wonder why.
I,
You're
I,
teaching
I'll
people to mask.
I'm going to big up Lorna Wing. Okay, I think it's the Lorna and John Wing Foundation. Lorna
Okay.
Wing there's a scientist that came along in the '90s and went, wait a minute, this isn't right. We need to start thinking about this, because autism doesn't present in everyone the same way.
Mm.
Like, nothing does.
Even just the idea of like women being too emotional, when it's just like, it's so obviously this, to me, it's so obviously a kind of a soft form of misogyny and a double standard, and all of
Yeah,
that, but it comes from these systems. I mean, ultimately it's systemic discrimination, essentially. If you're not making up an equitable representation within all levels of a medical framework, it's not a coincidence that what comes out of that is terrible outcome and comes for women, but the knock-on effect, we don't know. This unintended consequences of how
it's.
we
I
even
mean,
speak about women, it becomes, all part of the same
it's
thing.
really. If I went into my local town and I pulled up 100 random people, all right, of any ages or whatever else, what I would, if I asked them, if I turned around and said, what do you think autism is? I know what the response would probably be, but that's not what autism is. So, and that is a real problem, because if that's, did I tell you about that lady that came into my gym, a unit I was prepared to move into?
I don't think you did, actually.
Okay, so I won't go too far into it, but I nearly moved into a unit. I was looking at a new unit. I have to make sure that my current landlord doesn't hear this interview. Uh,
we'll,
but I
we'll
was
bleep
looking at
that
this
bit out.
unit, and long story short, this person actually turned up to my current unit to have a look at what I was doing. And they had some concerns, and I said, okay, cool. So I said, look, what are your concerns? And the first one was the noise, about how loud our weight would be dropping on the floor. And I said, well, look, like, we have rubber flooring,
Hmm.
and our weight plates are rubber coated. I said, so actually, we've already gone to a fairly good extent to stop that from happening. I said, but wait there, let me go and grab a weight and let me just drop it on the floor. I was like, that's the easiest way for you to understand how loud that is, by let's do it. So I dropped it on the floor, and she said, okay, what about if the rubber plates weren't on it? Oh, you mean just the bar? I was like, cool, let's do that as well. Like, like, it doesn't harm me to do that. Um,
It's so
and
pedantic.
yeah, yeah, well, sod it. Like, it's there, isn't it? And then when I said to her, I said, look, is there any other issues? To which she said, yeah, I'm not sure about the autistics. And I just sat there and I went,
It's
a
the
lot of
plural,
autistic.
as if it's this collective like
Yeah,
drop
yeah,
of, of,
yeah.
of
I was,
identity, right?
yeah. I sat and I went, oh, okay, this is bad, because you've basically said, I've said, I'm going to have to say no now, but and I said, just out of kind of, curiosity, what is it about autistic people? And she went, they're very aggressive. And I just sat and went, wow. I was like, I have no idea what you think you're talking about, but you're not talking about the thing that you think you're talking about. But that was a perception, you know. And the sad thing is, I mean, I didn't challenge her because we don't have time for me to go into this properly. And I don't know, I kind of didn't want to challenge because I just didn't think I was going to get anywhere with it.
I think that is a resistance I've seen, and it comes from just years of conditioning that we even would.
Yeah,
If I
absolutely.
didn't arrive at this diagnosis, and did, when I was younger, I had similar ideas about autism myself, and yeah, what that comes from for me is misunderstanding behavior. The idea that you just say, instead of understanding what people's needs are, it's just, this is how things are done. These statements that are like, it is what it is, that's my raw law. They don't really have that much inherent logic in them. But when you say that to someone who's autistic and actually misrepresent that anger as not actually a product of really early on, they have a certain need in terms of, it could be routine, it could be social interaction, whatever that is, you're projecting this judgment on them.
I've never met an autistic person that wasn't incredibly emotionally intelligent. Um, I think the thing is that I think you're right, and I think that we all probably guilty, those of us that aren't autistic, of having some preconceived notion of what it was.
Yeah.
But the sad thing is that it's not, and then a lot of the time we think of learning disabilities, so we think of developmental delay and stuff like that, and we couple that with autism.
We conflate a lot of the wider
Yeah,
developmental disorders.
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, don't get me
Disorder is a
wrong.
word I'm not particularly fond
No,
of,
I don't
but
like it either. I don't like it either. But the problem is that we autism has this over, like, oh well, that's coupled with it. And it's like, no, just like anything else, an asthmatic person could also be dyslexic, and I think that that's the big thing with autism. I think that. And to go back to kind of like the employment kind of thing, if you can turn around and make something right for someone, for an autistic person, okay, and an environment right that they can thrive and they are comfortable in and happy in, okay, autistic people are the most loyal people in the world, all right? So if you've got an
yep.
employee there that is happy and, is catered, his needs are met, his or her needs or their needs are met, all right. Well, you're going to have a member of staff there that is like just super loyal to what you're doing. Which, not being funny, as an employer, like that's kind of a cool thing.
And there's some issues that are red herrings, and that's in hiring. We've moved to systemized approaches. I think it's in a kind of a half-baked approach to give this veneer of objectivity. It's come from DEI or people's misunderstanding of it. And so objectivity is the word, the buzzword, and measurement and consistency. And so we've got CVs, and they're like these pillars, and it's like just duplicating individuals.
Yeah.
And so that's creating a bit of a monolith. And then you've got this idea of, well, you have to hit all these different arbitrary standards, which by and large, I would imagine a lot of neurodivergent individuals just don't, for no fault of their own, just because they would have a different assessment, a different approach, right? And so we root out anything that deviates from that norm, and then we go back to the system. And when those people then no longer kind of hit those milestones and can't succeed, we wonder why that is. But again, for me, it's about just the acknowledgement. We have to acknowledge that when we make judgments, it isn't always measurable.
One of the things I keep on kind of thinking is that, I am a white, all right, and I am middle class. Okay, I went to a state school at the end. My mum's family were all dockers from Glasgow, all right, so quite poor actually. But my dad's side are actually really quite wealthy. And consequently, I went to boarding school until I was about 14 years old, which I hated, by the way.
A lot of people say that.
I hated it. It was hell. And I was much happier actually in a state school before I went there. But I sit there and I think to myself, one of the things I keep kind of coming up against is, because I think it's really important that, we look at different areas in society, and we sit there and we give them all the best kind of help to that whole leveling up thing, which I don't think is being done right. I think that kind of what I find really interesting is that you and I are from completely different, not really different, but as in the way if someone looked at it in a graph, we're from very different spaces, yet our experiences were almost nigh on the same.
So whilst I would, the kind of relative poverty, I would say, from a socio-economic stance, might played a part in my access to certain healthcare, certain education. I mean, how many of that, first of all, across most social standards, really, our healthcare isn't really addressing this ADHD or autism,
No, it's not.
kind of
No,
issue
it's not.
anyway. So even if you were very well off, especially if, when we grew up, and you're older than me, so it was much worse. But it's also realistically, when you look at the relatively broadly speaking, we're not that dissimilar. So I think it's that people don't know how to both see the kind of wider social context, but then also look at the other layers. And it's important, I think, these terms and these elements, these segments, when we're looking at pointing a problem and saying that's where we need to make progress. But when we're looking at an individual, we need to see it as all of those things constructed together. And that's why I think if you looked at most of what we have in common, it probably is going to come out pretty similar, because the neurodivergent aspect is probably the biggest challenge that we've had.
I think there is a hell of a lot of similarities, which I'm really glad of, actually, because it means we can have a conversation and stuff. The only reason why I kind of asked it was because I do tend to kind of think to myself, because I sit there and I know that kind of what I went through was horrific. I know it. There's no kind of distinguishing kind of whether it was or not. And I think something else I said to you like before was, as a kind of society, we tend to look at trauma in the sense that it has to be, for something to be traumatic, it has to be you saw someone getting shot in the face. Like,
it's not how the brain works, is it?
No.
I was saying this to someone, they were talking about this, really annoyed me. It's got parallels, but it's the same thing. Grief is exactly the same. Grief is all, to me, there is no acceptable form of grief. There is no right way to grieve. And so, someone was talking about a friend who was grieving because Liam Payne from One Direction passed, right? And what it can seem quite comical on the face of it, but when you think about it, that person had in their formative years have got loads of associations. So you're grieving more the loss of that memory of youth and what that means to you than the person. And that's just a simple kind of superficial version, right? But it's the same as an in-law, right? It might bring ideas of mortality. The point is we can't rationalize it and turn it into an outcome or a one thing. So when people say, oh, but you haven't, it's a race to the bottom narrative, you haven't been in war and you haven't, but the brain doesn't perceive it like that. It perceives grief in a very simplistic terms. It's, and it depends, and there's so much that makes that up, from genetics to your predisposition to stress triggers. So when I talk about ADHD, I try to speak to leaders and say, well, what are some of the challenges and barriers? I use the exact same approach on them. And when you include them on it and you talk about like personalizing support broadly, it seems to counteract that thing. But going back to what you said, so tell me about how you feel with that, because it can be really difficult for me when it's trivialized.
I really struggle with it. Like, I really, really struggle with it. I don't want, man, I mean, I could genuinely cry because of that, and have done many, many a time, I think that, growing up as a kid who at times didn't have any friends, most of the time it's because I didn't want them, if I'm completely honest. I kind of like pushed myself into kind of, pushed myself away from people. Then I remember my therapist said to me, like probably in the first year I was with him, he said, who are you? And saying, I have no idea. And I'm not trying to be dramatic with that, as in that was a absolute, I just don't know, because I've masked for so long that I've created so many kind of
coping mechanisms almost, right?
Well, but just layer upon layer of who I thought people wanted of me.
Yeah.
I mean, that started at school because I did it because I went to 9 different schools, and every single one I'd finish at it and I would change who I was so that I didn't get the problems I had at the last one, and I got really good at it and I just kept on doing it. So I didn't have a clue who I was, like, to be honest.
I still struggle with that. Because we're only just starting that journey of, I mean, we're not even at the halfway point, if for many people, that if you think about even just just really basics, like how can I be more productive and organized? No one
Oh,
taught us.
dude, I
So
don't even know that. I mean,
come back to that autodidact, right, thing. It's like we actually process information in tons of different ways if you break it down into all these, in terms of sensory, visual, and all that. And we only really teach in this prescribed way. And the curriculum is very, very narrow and direct. And so for me, I was in the background finding a way to teach myself. But when I was 10, I wasn't a professional teacher getting paid. So I'm not going to be instilling in myself the best ways of learning. And so you've got all these little strands that you're just unkinking, really. But the same with the identity thing. I was always in these social environments where I didn't like it's not that I'm not really masculine or not masculine. It was just very kind of hyper normative, boys,
yeah,
boys, boys, lads, lads, lads kind of thing. And it was like, I didn't mind 10 minutes of it, but I'm not a banter person as such. And I don't want to talk about football all the time. And so people, I said to the previous guest, everything was gay. That's gay.
I remember that.
You're so
No, I remember.
gay.
Yeah,
And
no,
it's
I
just
remember
like,
that.
I knew I was different because I was the only one who was like, no, you're weird. Like, what are you on about? How are we deriving like homosexuality from the fact that you're creative? It's just the
Yeah,
maddest thing in the
it's
world. So then you mask, and you're kind of going back to where you started from. Like maybe it was 8 when I first wasn't masking. So I'm 8 years old in my journey of knowing who I
yeah.
am in a way,
I'm younger because I had an epiphany moment a while ago, not too maybe like 3 months ago, not such a long time ago, and I actually remembered how I felt before I started doing it, and actually it was just a placid kid that
Me too.
wasn't really kind of thing, and it's funny, the whole masculinity thing. I hate it. I am
Me too.
I I I am very effeminate in certain parts of my life,
Same.
and quite proudly so, to be honest. I think there's nothing wrong with it. But I think growing up in those times, like if you think I'm 10 years older than you, so growing up in a time with a dad who's ex-special forces, like, yeah, I
Yeah.
mean,
Discipline
yeah,
is the
well,
word,
I
isn't it?
mean, horrific but he
Yeah.
was really racist and homophobic. So, I mean, I remember he's not now actually. I mean, I haven't spoken to him for a few years, but he has adapted to realizing that he was wrong, I think. But I remember being
Which is
like,
brilliant.
yeah, that is cool. That is cool. But I remember being like a teenager and puberty hitting me and just being like, am I gay? And I straight up can remember crying myself to sleep, like numerous times because I was just terrified that I was going to be gay and that, my life was already really, really hard. I thought, shit, don't throw that one on me as well. Like, I can't handle that. I can't handle what you've given me, like, let alone, do you know what I mean? Like, so that was really hard. And I
I had
think that,
exactly the same thing with similar upbringing. My dad, I'd never seen him cry in my entire life, ever, and everything was just like rigid, and how you had to do things was one way of thinking. There was no idea that to solve a problem, communication was an aspect of that, right?
oh no,
And
yeah.
and so I'm not against any display of masculinity, even the idea of someone being, butch and strong. It's not that I have a problem with. It's the idea that somehow it's about. I agree, problem solving and helping people is a good trait. That's what they kind of claim for. But then surely having good communication skills to arrive at what their experience is and validate that experience so you can solve that problem is the way you do it, instead of this stoicism, which is more a projection of masculinity, but actually you're not creating that safety so
So,
that people can actually show you what they really need. And so that's what I'm against. And my dad just, looks very stoic, and it's very much, he's a strong man. But then what came out of that, it's a very suppressed way of living, is a lot of behaviors that were really not great, and my mum not really doing well out of it. Myself and my brother, and me and my brother are very much like yourself, more open with our emotions, and it might not look like we are men, but I don't think that
yeah, I
there's any way
disagree.
of how can you
I
how can you
disagree.
create a judgment on that? It makes no sense. It's just
I
so
actually, I
arbitrary.
think, I think that a man, in my opinion, or my kind of ideal idea of, what is a real kind of what is a strong male figure. Okay, let's say male figure because you don't have to be a man to be a male figure.
I agree.
I think that actually looks like having kindness and compassion and
It does.
being able to be in touch with your feelings and, being able to do things that might, otherwise have been claimed to not to be manly, because ultimately that person is way more secure in their skin than anyone else. And, I don't think, and I worry actually, I worry a little bit, and I know that we're going on for time, but I worry a little bit at the moment because I see my son's kind of generation. He's nearly 15, and they're looking back at the 90s and going, oh yeah, they were cool. And it's like, no, they really weren't. Like, they were rubbish.
We all conformed. I've been in sticky nightclubs and just hating it and drinking. That comes to I was going to say the addiction thing actually, because I think it'd be really cool to speak about that. So my brother, I'm 99% sure he has ADHD, but I don't like to pathologize because he's actually very typical in the hyperactive kind of display of it. And he is an alcoholic and he's 10 years sober. But he had he had the very classic example of at school, you're an idiot, you're wrong, you're this, you're that. And he's actually gone on to kind of regulate himself in a way, and he's teaching now, funny enough, right? So it worked out for him. But even myself, I had spells of really, I might rationalize it to myself and say I wasn't addicted, but with drink, and all sorts really. In terms of I might as well say this now. There was a point when I was taking like pain prescription opioids, because, and ironically, they had the opposite impact that you would think. Where that would make someone placid, my chemistry was such that it actually switched on my brain, and so there is a lot of addiction in this community. Partly because I think the suppression leads to this destructive behavior, and so people want to escape, but also that dopamine reward system, of which really an issue in ADHD is a part of it. But how did it impact you? And do you think that there should have been things that could have put you on a different path?
Yeah, so I think that the biggest ones that I think of when it comes to that stuff is that, my childhood was pretty miserable. So, and I think that this is another problem, and I think you hit the nail on the head where it's a multifaceted kind of issue.
I think so, yeah.
I think that, and I think it is probably for most as well. That's the problem. I think that I got diagnosed with bipolar or just below bipolar in this scale system when I was 23. But before that, I used to take a lot of drugs. Ecstasy was kind of my main one, but other things as well, cocaine and whatever. I told you this before. I said my friends used to find it hilarious because we'd be in a pub and I'd do a couple of lines of coke in the toilet, and I'd come out and they'd be like, we did it, and I'd be like, oh yeah, no, I just had some coke, and they'd be like, what? You seem more normal than you did when you went in the toilet. And I was like, now looking back, I'm like going, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense now.
Yeah, dopamine, isn't it? It's not too dissimilar. It's a similar aspect to the medication that we take. Yeah, absolutely.
I think, but I think my biggest weakness has been alcohol, and still is probably, if I'm totally honest. But I find that it's a real hard to distinguish which is the ADHD part of this and which is just trauma. So, what I find is...
You'll never decouple the two, I don't think.
No, and I don't think you can. I think that they're into... I think one, like I said to you earlier, I said if you've just got ADHD and you went your whole life and you had a really good childhood, you probably still get trauma from the ADHD because of, social experiences and all the rest of it. So, I don't think they are you can't really separate them. But for me, I think that I wouldn't necessarily say addiction was the worry. I have thought about it quite a few times, don't get me wrong. I actually think that it was my risky behaviour that worries, that really, in hindsight, that I look back and I go, wow, I've done some really silly things.
It's really strange, is that when I was at school, it was almost like a pedestal that my mum put me on. I think in comparison to my brother, who had more classic kind of disruptive behaviour. And so I was just like hyper perfectionist and would just spend all my day studying. And when I look back, I clearly, even the ADHD, the fact that I needed so much time, and I'd go into hyper focus, and I was just forcing myself into this kind of hyper focus. And it developed, the OCD is what developed out of that. And so whilst I wasn't as problematic as I was younger, when I was about 17 or 18, it was just like a grenade had just exploded. And I just, every single thing that was kind of stable, I guess. It just all fell apart. So yeah, I mean, if I was going out and I had a few drinks, I wouldn't go out to have a fight, but I would say something to someone, or I would do something stupid, or I would, not remember that night. And then I just carried that into university. So I didn't know how to, put back together my mind, basically. And so every single, time we go to a club, it would just be drinking as much as I possibly could. And you just, in that moment, you don't really develop or learn anything. And so I had to take a lot of time just to rebuild myself. And until you was talking about self-help books, it started with a self-help book that kind of got me understanding a little bit more that these differences are a medical, there is a medical word for it, right?
Yeah.
But it wasn't, my diagnosis was kind of just the start of the unmasking, I guess. But that problematic behavior, I was lucky in that I managed to contain it, that no one has ever been hurt. I've never kind of done anything that I would, was terrible. But it was exactly the same thing, this real repression of who I was. And that just came out in the masking that was so heavily, built on me when I was younger.
I've always had the foresight to go and have a conversation with someone, so I will find someone, and it's probably been a bit weird. I mean, that's a typical ADHD thing, right? I reckon most people will be like, oh, happy to answer your questions, because actually I'd love it if people, started to realise who I am, opposed to these preconceived notions of what I am,
So I'll tell you something. So those two labels, dyslexia and ADHD, that you might think are like a tattoo on your forehead, you've articulated yourself in one of the best ways ever, one of the best conversations I had. I said this to you on the first conversation that we had. And, those, and ultimately have been a captive audience to me and my ramblings.
I love it.
And so I think it kind of speaks for itself in a way that the ADHD and the dyslexia doesn't. And you're a lot more than that, and you're a very interesting man. And so on that note, I will let you go back to your life. Let's do this again when you've got the spoons back.
Oh no, I've got enough spoons for this. I'm medicated. I'm fine. I'm loaded with spoons. I can lend you some spoons.